In this video, I film in a blizzard, some planes, and a man rides a train. Last winter, we took a vacation to Montreal on Amtrak's Adirondack service. We got on at Rhinecliff, New York, which was the closest station to where we live on the Adirondacks route. It's a small station, and the way it's built, you have to carry all your luggage over this bridge that crosses the tracks to get to the platform our train was going to be coming in at. Once we were on the train, I spawn camped this southbound by simply recording one long video out the window waiting for something to go by. A bit later, we arrived in Albany Rensselaer Station, where Amtrak replaces the Empire Service locomotive with a normal locomotive. For those who don't know what I mean by that, in early 2016, New York struck a deal with Amtrak to paint all locomotives that run in New York in the special Empire Service paint scheme. And since Amtrak's Adirondack goes out of New York, the Empire Service engine is taken off and replaced with a normally painted Amtrak engine. But as it turns out, the engine that would be leading our train to Canada would be Amtrak 108, the Phase 6 Heritage Unit. Once we had left Rensselaer, I got some nice B-roll of the shops Amtrak has at Rensselaer and saw the engine that was leading our train before come back past us after getting turned around on the Y. A bit later, we passed a Canadian Pacific yard, and while I wasn't recording, we passed two CP 6-axle engines on the close track, so I wasn't too happy about that. In Port Henry, New York, Lake Champlain and Mariah RS-18 number 20 is on display with a tiny ore car and a tiny caboose. I would tell you some info about this engine or this railroad, but after researching until my attention span expired, I couldn't find much info. In Keysville, New York, our Adirondack passed our southbound counterpart, which I missed the engines for, and after that we reached the USA-Canada border, which we were at for over an hour. By the time we reached Montreal proper, where I saw the engines you're seeing now, it was well into the nighttime. The next morning I was up early to catch 3 Via Rail trains heading out of Montreal Station in the early morning. The first one was this P42 DC that was leaving right as I got there, and while I was standing on the side of the road waiting, I noticed a big sculpture with stairs on it to my left. I walked over and realized that I could have a way better vantage point if I stand up on top of the sculpture. Next up was this F40PH-2 leaving to go to a different part of Canada, I forgot the destination, and after that was one of Via Rail's new REM transit shuttles. The REM in REM stands for
Réseau Express Métropolitain.
And the last thing to come out was a Via Rail Siemens Venture train set. Later that day, we went over to
La Grande Roue de Montréal,
where there's a large Ferris wheel right on the banks of the St. Lawrence River. While walking over there, I noticed that there was a railroad track going right by it, and I thought, man, it would be cool if a train goes by while we're up on the Ferris wheel.
Your wish is granted.
While we were at the highest point on the wheel, a pair of Canadian National GP38-2s came crawling by our pod, and I had a nice aerial view of the small train. I don't have a drone, yet, but it turns out I don't need one. I should just get a Ferris wheel. The next morning I was up early again to see another Siemens Venture train set and another P42 DC. On this day, we went on a tour of Montreal's underground city. Since it gets so cold in Montreal, there is a large interconnected system of underground malls, stores, walkways, concert halls, living areas, and restaurants all under the city. It's all connected and connects with the Montreal Metro, which we took a few times on the tour. Our tour guide told us some really cool info about these trains and stations. The interior of each station was designed by a different artist, so every station is different from the other from the interior design perspective. Also, homeless people are fully allowed into the subway stations and are allowed to sleep and inhabit the stations because it gets so cold out there that it's unethical to force them to stay out in the cold. The subway stations are much warmer, so the government passed a law saying the homeless and less fortunate are welcome into the stations. Also, every metro runs on rubber tires instead of flange wheels because they can accelerate faster and go up steeper inclines. The second point is important because at every station the track has an incline up towards the station. Think of it like each station is on the top of a hill. This is so that trains can use the hills to decelerate faster when arriving and accelerate faster when leaving. Not a single part of this metro system goes above ground or outside for any reason because the air inside those rubber tires would expand and contract in the cold versus hot temperatures, which would cause wear and tear on the wheels. At most stations, the trains run 5 minutes apart and their top speed is 45 miles per hour. One of the days we were there, I noticed that there were several Boeing 777s flying into Montreal's airport, and since I had never seen a 777 and I wanted to, I took the metro and a few buses to go see it. After a really long trip out there, I arrived in time to catch this Air Canada 777 landing, and then I moved closer to the approach line and got a second 777 landing with the sun setting behind it. And just like that, our trip was over. While leaving Montreal station, there was an XO
F59PH
sitting in the station, and once we were outside, we passed another.
Réseau Express Métropolitain.
Once we were outside the city, I caught a REM shuttle going over a stopped Via Rail F40PH as our train went by. Once we were on the Victoria Bridge, a Siemens Venture train set jump-scared me before we entered the Canadian National Yard. In the yard, there was a GP9RM and another paired with a GP38-2, and there was an arriving Canadian National Manifest with a little surprise on the back in the form of a Bluebird GP38-2. And after seeing two more GP38-2s on the way out, I realized that our train was again being led by Amtrak 108.
Nice.
What are the odds of that? I mean, I know that sometimes you'll get heritage units running the same trains back and forth for a little bit, but to get one to lead your train on the trip up and then have it lead your train again on the way home is pretty improbable, it has to be. Once we were in Keysville, I remembered that this is where we passed the other Adirondack, so I was prepared and ready to catch the northbound Adirondack. After that, our train was following the bank of Lake Champlain, so I took a time-lapse of us winding our way back and forth along the cliffside. I then remembered to start recording at the same Canadian Pacific yard where I missed those two CP engines on the way up, and for some reason I recorded the engines in 0.5x zoom. For those who don't know, iPhones have a default camera zoom, but they can zoom out to 0.5x zoom, which is like zooming out even further. Well, this camera behaves differently than the normal camera, and one of the ways it differs is the quality is much worse. And in this instance, it picks up the glare way more than the normal camera, so I recorded these Canadian Pacific engines in a completely unnecessary low amount of quality. Later, we passed the SMS Railroad Company's SW9 in Fort Edward, New York, and again we passed the Canadian Pacific engine pair, but the problem with this video was it was too dark for there to be any good amount of quality. I just can't get a good video of Canadian Pacific engines, can I? Once we were back in Rensselaer, I filmed the entire process of our train engines being switched out in the freezing cold, and we were back on our way south. And on our way we were, because I clocked our train going a blistering 111 miles per hour. Our engineer then needed to deploy the parachute to come to a stop back at Rhinecliff to let us off. And that would be the last wheels I'd see on this trip. As always, there's a link to the unedited videos down in the description below. Now if you'll excuse me, I have to go shovel the driveway. Thank you for watching, have a satisfactory day.